In the wake of the Civil War, the United States stood at a crossroads. The nation had endured 4 years of bloodshed and heartbreak, and now faced the monumental challenge of rebuilding not just its cities and economy, but its very soul, with the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. An extraordinary promise took shape. Millions of formerly enslaved Black Americans were no longer property, they were free citizens, entitled to the rights and dignity of full participation in American life. Across the South, a remarkable transformation unfolded. Black men registered to vote in unprecedented numbers, many casting ballots for the very first time. Some did not just vote, they ran for office and won, from local councils to state legislatures, and even in the halls of Congress. Their voices began to shape a new vision of democracy. Teachers and preachers turned into civic leaders. Farmers became lawmakers. It was a moment when the ideals of the Declaration of Independence seemed closer to reality than ever before. Communities sprang to life with an energy that defied centuries of oppression. Schools for Black children opened at a breathtaking pace, often built by the hands of those who had once been denied the right to read or write. Businesses, churches, and neighborhood associations flourished, creating networks of support and pride. Families united after years of forced separation. The dream of equality, for a fleeting moment, felt within reach. But this was more than a story of newfound rights, it was a story of courage and determination. Every vote cast, every classroom built, every business started was an act of hope and resistance. These men and women were not merely recipients of freedom. They were architects of their own future, proving that democracy thrives when all voices are heard. As we look back on this pivotal chapter in American history, we are reminded that the fight for justice and equality is not a relic of the past. It is a living challenge and a shared responsibility. Their struggle, their triumphs, and their unwavering belief in the promise of America continue to inspire us today. If you find these stories as powerful and essential as we do, join us in keeping this history alive. Like this video, share it with others who care about understanding our collective past, and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories that matter. Your support helps us bring these voices from history to light and ensures that their legacy continues to guide us toward a more just and inclusive future. Yet as this bold experiment in democracy blossomed, a shadow began to grow across the Southern landscape. For many former Confederates, the sight of Black Americans voting, winning elections, opening schools, and building thriving communities was not simply unsettling. It was, in their eyes, a profound challenge to the social order they had long taken for granted. They saw the rising political and economic influence of their formerly enslaved neighbors as a direct threat to their own power and identity. And in the aftermath of defeat, resentment hardened into organized defiance. This defiance did not appear overnight. It started in whispers, in quiet meetings behind closed doors, where men who had once worn the gray uniforms of the Confederacy gathered to speak of restoring the world they had lost. At first, the language was careful, cloaked in the rhetoric of states' rights and tradition, but soon the intent became unmistakable. They were not simply mourning the past. They were plotting to shape the future. They sought to undermine the fragile gains of Reconstruction by whatever means they could muster, through intimidation, through manipulation, and, when subtlety failed, through sheer force. In this charged atmosphere, clandestine organizations emerged with names that would soon strike fear across entire counties. The Ku Klux Klan, initially formed in Tennessee, cloaked its members in anonymity as they rode through the night, their faces hidden beneath white hoods. What began as secret fraternity quickly evolved into a network of coordinated terror, aimed squarely at the men and women whose newfound rights symbolized a changing nation. Voter registration drives, political meetings, and even church gatherings became targets. The goal was not just to frighten individuals, but to send a chilling message to every black citizen who dared to imagine equality. Step back, or pay the price. The Klan was not alone. Groups such as the White League in Louisiana and the Red Shirts in the Carolinas adopted a more open, almost paramilitary style, dispensing with the secrecy of hoods and masks. Dressed in striking uniforms, they paraded in daylight, making no attempt to hide their mission. Their very visibility was the point. By marching through towns and appearing at polling places, they meant to show that they were the true arbiters of power, the self-appointed guardians of an old order they refused to relinquish. Their operations were carefully planned to influence elections and intimidate not only black voters but also white allies who supported Reconstruction governments. These organizations fed on local frustrations and wove them into a wider campaign. Their tactics ranged from economic coercion pressuring employers, threatening tenants, and boycotting black-owned businesses to violent attacks designed to break the will of entire communities. Night after night, stories spread of riders appearing suddenly on quiet roads, of homes set ablaze, of families forced to flee under the cover of darkness. Fear became a weapon as potent as any rifle, undermining the fragile sense of security that Reconstruction leaders had struggled to build. Yet the story of this resistance is not only one of terror. It is also a window into the complex struggle for power in a nation redefining itself. Many of these groups claimed they were defending local autonomy, but their actions revealed a deeper purpose: to ensure that the political and economic advancements of black Americans would be temporary. They sought to write their own version of history, to re-establish a hierarchy that the Civil War had supposedly ended, and to send a signal to Washington that federal intervention could be defied. For those working tirelessly to expand democracy, the rise of such movements posed a heartbreaking test. Black legislators and their allies often stood their ground with remarkable bravery. Churches became meeting halls for strategy and solidarity, while newspapers chronicled both the violence and the courage of those who refused to retreat. Every election held under the threat of violence became an act of defiance in itself. The very fact that schools continued to open and communities continued to grow despite relentless pressure was a testament to resilience that cannot be overstated. But the cost was immense. The federal government, initially committed to protecting the rights enshrined in the Reconstruction Amendments, began to waver. Political fatigue set in the North, and as national priorities shifted, the will to enforce protections weakened. Supreme Court decisions chipped away at the legal foundations of Reconstruction, and federal troops were gradually withdrawn from the South. In the vacuum, the violent campaigns of groups like the Klan, the White League, and the Red Shirts gained momentum, shaping local politics and setting the stage for a system of racial segregation that would endure for generations. This chapter of history reveals not only the fragility of progress, but also the tenacity of those who sought to preserve it. The struggle between those building a more inclusive democracy and those determined to turn back the clock defined the late 19th century and left an imprint that can still be traced in American society today. The story of Reconstruction is therefore not merely about laws and amendments. It is about the courage of communities that dared to claim their rights and the relentless opposition they faced. Understanding both the triumphs and the dark resistance of this era is essential to understanding the challenges of equality and justice that continue to echo through the nation's history. The campaign to undermine Reconstruction did not rely on intimidation alone. It descended into calculated brutality that shook the very foundation of the young democracy. As the struggle over the future of the South deepened, violence became a tool as deliberate as any law or policy. It was not the chaotic violence of a society unraveling, but a chilling strategy, carried out with the purpose of silencing black political participation and dismantling the fragile governments that had emerged after the Civil War. In the years that followed the first hopeful elections of freedmen, the night air often carried the sound of riders approaching, and communities braced for the terror that might follow. These were years when ambition for equality and the fear of change collided in deadly fashion. The men who plotted this campaign of terror were often the same who had once fought to preserve the Confederacy or who had risen to local prominence in its aftermath. They understood that the ballot box was a powerful equalizer, and that every vote cast by a newly enfranchised black citizen threatened to shift the balance of power. For them, the solution was to make the very act of voting perilous, to transform participation in democracy into a risk few would dare to take. Among the most infamous of these acts of violence was the 1873 Colfax Massacre in Louisiana. In the tense months following a disputed election, armed white militias gathered with a single goal: to wrest control of the local government by force. Black citizens, many of them veterans of the Union Army, took up a defensive position around the courthouse to protect their elected officials. What began as a standoff quickly spiraled into bloodshed. When the smoke cleared, dozens of black defenders lay dead, some killed in battle, many others executed after surrendering. The message was unmistakable. Those who stood for Reconstruction would pay with their lives. Just 3 years later, in 1876, the town of Hamburg, South Carolina, became the stage for another grim episode. A black militia company, part of the state's legally recognized National Guard, found itself surrounded by a far larger force of white men determined to break their resolve. After hours of tension, gunfire erupted, and when the confrontation ended, several black militiamen were captured and murdered. The Hamburg Massacre, like Colfax before it, was not an isolated outburst. It was a calculated show of force at a moment when state elections hung in the balance. An unmistakable warning that black political influence would be met with deadly opposition. Lynchings and assassinations became a recurring feature of public life during this era. Leaders who dared to organize voters or speak out for civil rights were marked for death, their murders carried out in broad daylight or under cover of darkness. These killings were not random. They were designed to break the spirit of communities and to convince others that resistance was futile. The terror spread beyond the immediate victims, seeping into every conversation, every church gathering, every school meeting. To cast a vote, to hold a meeting, even to walk proudly down a street became acts of quiet defiance. Federal authorities attempted to respond with laws intended to protect citizens and prosecute perpetrators. But the determination of those who sought to restore the old order was relentless. Enforcement acts passed by Congress allowed federal troops and marshals to intervene, and for a brief time there were arrests and trials. Yet the machinery of justice was slow and often sympathetic to the accused, and the will to sustain federal action waned as political priorities shifted in the North. Court decisions narrowed the reach of federal protections, and each setback emboldened those who used violence to shape the political landscape. The psychological weight of this campaign of terror cannot be overstated. Families lived with the knowledge that a knock on the door after nightfall could signal the end of a life. Black citizens who had once stepped confidently into polling places now faced the agonizing decision of whether exercising their rights was worth the danger. Community leaders who continued to organize risked not only their own lives but the safety of their loved ones. Yet even under such pressure, many refused to retreat completely. Schools continued to teach, churches continued to preach, and some voters continued to brave the gauntlet of threats and intimidation. Their persistence was a testament to the resilience of those who believed that freedom was not a gift, but a right to be claimed and defended. Still, the cumulative impact of the violence was undeniable. Reconstruction governments, already fragile, struggled to maintain order and legitimacy as their supporters were murdered or driven from public life. In many places, the ballot became a hollow promise as fear succeeded where law had failed. The massacres at Colfax and Hamburg were more than local tragedies. They were pivotal moments in a wider campaign to reverse the gains of Reconstruction and to signal to the entire nation that the experiment in multiracial democracy could be rolled back. By the end of the 1870s, the tide had turned. Federal troops withdrew, political compromises left Southern states to govern themselves, and the vision of an inclusive democracy receded. The era that had begun with the hope of a nation reborn closed under the weight of terror and the triumph of those who sought to reimpose racial hierarchy. The scars of this violence did not fade with time. They became part of the nation's memory, a somber reminder of how fragile progress can be, and how easily the promise of equality can be undermined when fear is wielded as a weapon. Understanding these events is essential not only for what they reveal about the past, but for the light they shed on the continuing challenge of protecting the rights of all citizens in a democracy. As the tide of racial violence threatened to wash away the fragile victories of Reconstruction, the federal government faced an urgent test of will. In Washington, the presidency of Ulysses Grant, former Union general and the man who had brought Confederacy to surrender, became the focal point of a national struggle over whether the ideals won on the battlefield could survive in peacetime. Grant, a soldier who understood the cost of war, recognized that the terror sweeping through the South was not a series of random crimes, but a coordinated campaign to overturn the hard-won amendments that promised freedom, citizenship, and the vote to millions of formerly enslaved people. He saw in the nightly raids, the lynchings, and the massacres the same defiance that had fueled secession, now reborn in the shadows of a supposedly reunited nation. Grant's first instinct was to fight. He urged Congress to give him the tools to protect the fragile democracy that was struggling to take root. The result was the series of laws known as the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, legislation crafted to strike directly at the heart of organized terror. These acts empowered the federal government to prosecute individuals who conspired to deny citizens their constitutional rights, to place federal elections under national supervision, and to deploy troops when local authorities failed to act. For the first time, the federal government claimed an explicit role in safeguarding the right to vote, not merely as a moral principle but as a matter of national security. Grant used these powers with a soldier's decisiveness. Federal marshals and troops moved into counties where the Ku Klux Klan's influence was strongest, arresting hundreds of its members and placing entire regions under martial law when necessary. Trials were held in federal courts, and for a brief period the veil of impunity was pierced. Night riders who had once terrorized black voters and their white allies with confidence now faced the prospect of prison. Communities that had lived in fear began to glimpse the possibility that the law could shield them, that the promises of the Reconstruction amendments might be defended not only on paper but in practice. For a moment, it seemed as if the nation might indeed complete the work of the Civil War. Black voters returned to the polls in greater numbers, and the presence of federal authority sent a message that the United States government would not tolerate an armed rebellion in peacetime. Grant himself declared that the Klan's power had been broken. Newspapers across the North hailed these victories, and the men and women who had risked everything to build schools, churches, and local governments allowed themselves a cautious hope that progress, though fragile, might endure. Yet even as these successes unfolded, the ground beneath them began to shift. The North, weary from years of war and Reconstruction, grew restless. Economic turmoil struck in the Panic of 1873, turning public attention toward financial survival and away from the distant violence in the South. Political scandals in Washington eroded trust in Grant's administration, giving his opponents an opening to argue that federal intervention in Southern affairs was too costly and too heavy-handed. The moral urgency that had once driven abolition and Reconstruction gave way to a growing desire for national reconciliation, even if that reconciliation meant sacrificing the rights of those who had once been enslaved. Southern white leaders understood this change in mood and exploited it skillfully. They portrayed federal enforcement as an occupation, casting themselves as defenders of local self-government. Their appeals resonated with Northern politicians eager to end the long and expensive project of Reconstruction. Newspaper editorials began to speak of letting the South handle its own problems, a phrase that, for those living under constant threat of violence, was a chilling signal that the federal shield might soon be withdrawn. Grant, for all his determination, could not stem the political tide alone. Each year it became harder to secure funding and congressional support for federal operations in the South. Court decisions narrowed the reach of the enforcement acts, and juries often composed of men sympathetic to the very organizations the laws targeted hesitated to convict. The Klan, though temporarily scattered, evolved and reappeared under different names and looser networks. Groups such as the White League and the Red Shirts adopted new tactics, some abandoning the secrecy of hoods for the brazen display of armed militias in broad daylight. Confident that the federal government no longer had the resolve to stop them. By the mid-1870s, the promise that the national government would guarantee the rights of black citizens had begun to erode. Reconstruction governments, already under siege from assassinations and massacres, found themselves increasingly isolated. The federal presence that once brought a measure of protection grew thinner until it was little more than a symbol. The same North that had once sent its sons to fight and die for the Union now recoiled from the continued burden of defending its newest citizens. Grant's presidency, which began with the hope of completing Lincoln's unfinished work, closed with the sobering recognition that military victory had not guaranteed political justice. The enforcement acts remained on the books, but without the will to enforce them, they became hollow promises. In the vacuum left by retreating federal power, state governments hostile to Reconstruction tightened their grip, paving the way for decades of legalized segregation and disenfranchisement. This chapter of American history reveals the uneasy truth that laws, no matter how noble, depend on the courage and persistence of those who enforce them. For a brief moment, President Grant and the Enforcement Acts struck a blow against the forces of terror and proved that the federal government could defend democracy against those who sought to destroy it. But when political will faltered, the enemies of Reconstruction regained their momentum, and the dream of a multiracial democracy, so vivid in the first years after the Civil War, was left vulnerable to the very forces it had sought to overcome. The lesson lingers. Progress requires not only brave leaders and bold legislation, but the enduring commitment of a nation unwilling to turn away when the work of justice grows difficult. The waning years of Reconstruction unfolded like the slow dimming of a great light. After the early victories of federal action and the brief surge of hope that followed the enforcement acts, the forces of reaction learned to fight not only with rifles and torches, but with the quiet weapons of the courtroom and the bargaining table. It was in the marble halls of the Supreme Court and the smoke-filled rooms of political deal-making that the fate of multiracial democracy was sealed, and the promise born of the Civil War began to slip beyond reach. The Colfax Massacre of 1873 had already exposed the terrible vulnerability of black citizens in the South. Dozens were killed defending their right to a government of their choosing, and the nation watched as federal prosecutors brought charges against the attackers. Many believed that justice, at last, would prove stronger than mob violence. Yet when the case reached the highest court in the land in the form of United States v. Cruikshank, the decision that emerged in 1876 was a blow from which the ideals of Reconstruction would never fully recover. The court ruled that the federal government lacked the constitutional authority to prosecute individuals for acts of racial violence unless the perpetrators were acting as agents of a state. In effect, it declared that the protection of citizens from private terror was a matter for state governments alone, even when those governments were complicit or indifferent. This ruling sent a signal as clear as any rider's call in the night. Groups that had once faced the threat of federal prosecution now understood that the nation's highest court had closed the door to meaningful intervention. State officials sympathetic to the old social order could shrug at the cries for justice. Knowing that Washington's reach had been clipped, the decision did more than free the men charged with the Colfax killings. It weakened the very foundation of the federal commitment to civil rights. Black communities, already battered by years of intimidation, were left to face the future with a dwindling sense of protection and a growing awareness that the promise of citizenship could be hollowed out by legal precedent as effectively as by violence. At the same time, political will in the North was evaporating. The Panic of 1873 had drained the economy and shifted attention to financial survival. Scandals in Washington and fatigue from a decade of Southern occupation eroded the appetite for continued federal oversight. By the presidential election of 1876, the once fiery commitment to Reconstruction had cooled to a flicker. The contest between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden descended into bitter dispute as returns from several Southern states were contested, and the nation teetered on the edge of a constitutional crisis. Behind doors, party leaders sought a solution to the deadlock, and in those late-night negotiations the future of millions was quietly bartered away. The arrangement that emerged, later known as the Compromise of 1877, gave Hayes the presidency he needed and the Democrats the withdrawal of federal troops they demanded. No formal document announced the deal, but its terms were unmistakable. The last garrisons of Union soldiers would leave the South, and with them would go the final vestiges of federal protection for black citizens and the Reconstruction governments they supported. When those troops marched away, they carried with them the fragile barrier that had stood between black voters and the forces determined to suppress them. Southern leaders wasted no time in reasserting control. State legislatures, now free from the oversight of federal troops and emboldened by the Supreme Court's narrowing of federal authority, moved to tighten the grip of racial hierarchy. Violence, no longer checked by national enforcement, once again became a tool of political power, and the few remaining Reconstruction officials found themselves isolated and overwhelmed. For the men and women who had risked everything to build schools, to hold office, and to exercise the right to vote, the change was swift and devastating. Communities that had blossomed with a sense of possibility now faced the return of open intimidation and the slow construction of new legal barriers. The hope that the Civil War had permanently reshaped the nation gave way to the hard reality that freedom without protection is a fragile thing. The dream of an America where citizenship meant equal safety under the law was receding like a mirage. The withdrawal of federal power and the Supreme Court's ruling in Cruikshank did more than end a chapter of policy. They set the stage for nearly a century of legalized segregation and disenfranchisement. The men who had once ridden at night to spread fear no longer needed secrecy. Their goals could now be pursued in broad daylight through state constitutions. Voting restrictions, and the rise of laws that came to be known as Jim Crow. The arc of progress that had seemed so promising in the heady days after Appomattox was bent sharply backward, not by the force of battlefield defeat but by the slow, calculated retreat of political courage. Yet even in this moment of retreat, the legacy of Reconstruction refused to disappear entirely. The amendments that enshrined freedom, citizenship, and the vote remained written into the Constitution, dormant but unbroken, waiting for a later generation to claim them anew. The men and women who had struggled for their rights during those turbulent years passed on their stories. Their faith, and their unshaken belief that the promises of democracy, once made, could never be entirely erased. The fall of Reconstruction stands as both a caution and a challenge, that the defense of justice cannot rest on laws or leaders alone, and that the work of equality demands vigilance long after the battles seem to be won. As the last Union soldiers departed from Southern towns and the Compromise of 1877 closed the door on federal enforcement, a new era of systemic control rose from the ashes of Reconstruction. one that would entrench inequality for generations. The ambitions of black citizens voting in unprecedented numbers, holding office, building schools, and establishing thriving communities were suddenly confronted by a society determined to erase the gains of freedom, not through open rebellion alone, but through laws crafted with precision to subvert democracy while maintaining the illusion of legality. Southern legislatures, emboldened by the absence of federal oversight, set about constructing a framework of oppression that would suffocate black political and economic life, ensuring that the hopes kindled in the wake of emancipation would remain just out of reach for decades to come. Poll taxes were among the first tools employed in this quiet war. Ostensibly neutral, these fees required every citizen to pay a sum before being allowed to vote, a sum that could be easily afforded by white citizens but often insurmountable for black laborers and poor white farmers alike. The tax was not just a financial barrier, it carried a psychological weight, signaling to black communities that their participation in governance was conditional and expendable, a privilege rather than a right. Alongside poll taxes came literacy tests, another seemingly reasonable mechanism designed to protect the integrity of elections. Yet these tests were administered in an entirely arbitrary fashion, often impossible to pass regardless of education or preparation, and examiners could exercise absolute discretion, failing black citizens while overlooking white applicants. Through these measures, the very act of casting a ballot, a cornerstone of democratic agency, became a minefield of intimidation, humiliation, and exclusion, stripping away the hard-won political power that Reconstruction had briefly afforded. Adding to this systematic disenfranchisement was the insidious grandfather clause, a legal loophole designed to protect white voters while barring black citizens from the polls. It allowed any man to vote only if his grandfather had been eligible to vote before 1867, a date that conveniently preceded emancipation, effectively ensuring that generations of black men were legally excluded from electoral participation. Together, poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses created a formidable barrier to black civic life, rolling back the remarkable gains made in the decade after the Civil War and transforming the South into a landscape where legal structures reinforced racial hierarchy as thoroughly as any mob or militia had in previous years. This legal repression was complemented by the codification of racial segregation, a system that would permeate every aspect of daily life. In the landmark case Plessy v. Ferguson of 1896, the Supreme Court affirmed the doctrine of separate but equal, providing constitutional sanction for a social order that treated black citizens as second class, while preserving the veneer of legality and fairness. Trains, schools, restaurants, theaters, public restrooms, and drinking fountains were divided along racial lines, often with facilities for black Americans deliberately underfunded, overcrowded, or neglected. What was legally equal in name was anything but in practice. Black schools lacked resources, black hospitals faced chronic shortages, and black neighborhoods were starved of investment. Yet all of this was justified by the courts under the guise of constitutional propriety. Segregation became not merely a social custom but an enforced, systematic tool of oppression, entwined with the mechanisms of voter suppression to create a society in which black citizenship existed only in theory. The consequences of these measures were profound and far-reaching. In communities across the South, political representation for black Americans collapsed, and the risk of retaliation for attempting to exercise rights became a constant threat. Public spaces, economic opportunities, and the ability to shape local governance were all restricted by a combination of intimidation, legal maneuvering, and the enforcement of Jim Crow laws, even as black families built businesses, schools, and institutions. They faced not only social hostility, but the structural impediments of laws designed to limit wealth accumulation and generational mobility. In cities and towns across the South, thriving black neighborhoods became vulnerable to destruction, whether through legal maneuvering, economic marginalization, or direct acts of violence. The apparatus of systemic exclusion had effectively replaced the open terror of Reconstruction era. Militias were the more insidious and enduring form of control, one that would shape the American landscape for generations. Despite the oppressive climate, Black Americans did not vanish from the public sphere. Activists, journalists, educators, and community leaders continued to organize, advocate, and resist. Organizations such as the NAACP emerged to challenge the legal framework of segregation, while black churches and civic institutions became crucial centers for both political activism and social support. Yet, the legal and structural barriers imposed by poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and the Plessy decision meant that these efforts were constantly constrained, forcing black communities to fight not only for justice in individual cases, but against an entire system designed to curtail their rights and limit their influence. This era illustrates a chilling lesson in how law can be weaponized to enforce inequality, and how legal sanction can make oppression both systematic and enduring. The gains of Reconstruction were real, yet fragile, and the withdrawal of federal protection, coupled with Supreme Court endorsement of segregation, demonstrated that rights alone, no matter how constitutionally enshrined, require vigilance, enforcement, and political will to protect. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and legalized segregation became enduring tools to maintain white dominance, showing that oppression need not always take the form of overt violence. It can thrive in silence, in courts, and in legislatures, embedding inequality into the very fabric of society while masking its brutality behind the legitimacy of law. In tracing the arc from the promise of Reconstruction to the establishment of Jim Crow, one sees both the resilience and the vulnerability of democracy, the power of law to protect or to oppress, and the persistent struggle required to ensure that freedom is not merely a word but a lived reality. Black Americans had tasted the possibilities of political and economic empowerment in the brief decades following the Civil War, and while the structures of suppression were formidable, the spirit of resistance, the commitment to education, community, and advocacy persisted, laying the groundwork for the civil rights movements that would rise in the 20th century and beyond. The story of this period is a testament to both the fragility of progress and the enduring courage of those who refuse to accept oppression as fate. As the Jim Crow era tightened its grip across the South, the promise of Reconstruction, the fleeting dream of equality and empowerment for Black Americans, was systematically dismantled, not only through legal disenfranchisement and segregation, but through a sustained campaign of economic and social suppression that would leave scars for generations. The violent acts that had once erupted in the streets, such as lynchings, massacres, and intimidation, evolved into more insidious, yet equally devastating forms of oppression, aimed not merely at restricting individual freedoms, but at erasing black prosperity and consolidating white economic dominance. Land that black families had painstakingly acquired in the decades following emancipation, representing both freedom and the possibility of generational wealth, was often seized through fraud, coercion, or outright theft. Communities that had flourished briefly after the Civil War, such as the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, famously known as Black Wall Street, became prime targets for envy and violence. And when white mobs descended in 1921, hundreds were killed, businesses were destroyed, and homes were burned, erasing decades of hard-earned progress in a single night. These attacks were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern in which black success provoked targeted, deliberate responses aimed at restoring white supremacy, ensuring that wealth and opportunity remained out of reach for the majority of black citizens. Redlining and discriminatory lending practices further entrenched this economic disparity. Banks and mortgage institutions, often operating in concert with government policies, systematically denied black families the ability to purchase or improve property in safe and desirable neighborhoods, funneling them instead into underfunded areas with limited infrastructure and economic opportunity. Even where black families succeeded in establishing thriving businesses or communities. Zoning laws, highway construction, and urban renewal projects frequently targeted these areas for destruction, displacing residents and dismantling networks of black enterprise. The economic violence extended beyond property. Black workers were routinely denied fair employment, faced unequal, and were often locked out of labor unions, creating a cycle in which poverty became both a cause and a consequence of systemic discrimination. The cumulative effect of these practices was staggering. By 19, black Americans owned significant acreage of land, but within a generation, much of it had been lost due to deceptive contracts, legal manipulation, and overt theft, depriving countless families of the opportunity to build wealth that could be passed down to future generations. Lynchings, while often perceived solely as acts of terror, also served a calculated economic and social purpose. Each public execution was a demonstration of power, a brutal message that resistance to the established racial order could have fatal consequences. Beyond instilling fear, these acts directly affected the ability of black individuals to participate in the economy. Survivors and their families faced immediate intimidation, often forced to abandon homes, businesses, and farms, disrupting the development of stable, prosperous communities. The psychological impact compounded the material losses, fostering a pervasive climate of fear that inhibited investment in education, entrepreneurship, and political engagement. Communities that had briefly experienced autonomy and self-determination were left demoralized and vulnerable, making them susceptible to further economic exploitation and legal marginalization. Throughout the North, these dynamics were mirrored in subtler yet equally destructive ways. Although northern states did not enact Jim Crow laws with the same overt brutality as the South, systemic racism shaped housing, employment, and education policies, ensuring that black families migrating from the South in search of safety and opportunity were still constrained. Practices such as redlining, exclusion from unions, and discriminatory lending created segregated neighborhoods and concentrated poverty, perpetuating the cycle of inequality that began in the post-Reconstruction South. Even as black communities attempted to establish networks of mutual aid, schools, and businesses, these efforts were systematically undermined by policies and practices designed to maintain racial hierarchies and limit economic mobility. Wealth that could have been accumulated and leveraged to secure long-term security was consistently siphoned away, whether through violent means or the slow, persistent erosion imposed by legal and institutional barriers. The interplay of violence, legal exclusion, and economic oppression created a feedback loop that reinforced systemic inequality. Black Americans were denied the political power to advocate for change, the economic resources to resist exploitation, and the social leverage to protect their communities. In this environment, cycles of poverty and marginalization became entrenched, with each generation inheriting both the material and psychological consequences of decades of targeted oppression. Efforts to build wealth, education, and civic influence were persistently undermined, leaving communities structurally disadvantaged in ways that resonated long past the official end of Reconstruction and the dismantling of the Freedmen's Bureau. Every act of violence, every confiscated plot of land, every denied loan, was not just a moment of injustice, but a deliberate step in a comprehensive strategy to erase black progress and entrench a racially stratified society. Yet, amid this persistent adversity, resilience emerged. Black communities, despite the systemic barriers arrayed against them, continue to establish schools, churches, businesses, and civic organizations, creating spaces of empowerment and cultural affirmation within a hostile society. Figures like Marcus Garvey advocated for economic independence and the creation of self-sustaining black communities, while journalists and activists exposed the ongoing injustices, drawing national attention to systemic exploitation and violence. The determination to preserve dignity, accumulate wealth, and resist oppression became a defining characteristic of black life in the United States, a testament to the enduring human spirit in the face of relentless structural inequality. This history demonstrates how the legacy of Reconstruction's failure extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. The combination of racial violence, land theft, redlining, and economic discrimination created enduring patterns of inequality that shaped every aspect of American life well into the 20th century and beyond. It illustrates how oppression can evolve, moving from overt terror to subtle institutionalized mechanisms, and how systemic inequality can be perpetuated through law, policy, and economic manipulation. Understanding these interconnected forces is essential not only for interpreting the past, but for confronting their lingering effects today, reminding us that the fight for equality and justice requires vigilance, advocacy, and a commitment to dismantling the structures that allow historical inequities to persist. As we reflect on the long arc of American history, it becomes impossible to ignore the direct line connecting the Reconstruction era to the present day, a line drawn in struggle, resistance, and resilience. The violence, oppression, and systematic disenfranchisement that defined the post-Civil War South did not end with the withdrawal of federal troops or the passage of Jim Crow laws. Rather, these structures of white supremacy evolved, adapting to new social, political, and legal contexts, while maintaining the same fundamental goal: to suppress black empowerment and protect entrenched systems of privilege. The mechanisms may have changed from lynchings and massacres to voter suppression laws, mass incarceration, economic marginalization, and state-sanctioned discrimination, but the intent remains disturbingly consistent: to control who holds power, who has access to resources, and whose voices are heard in the corridors of governance. In many, the echoes of Reconstruction-era terror can still be felt in contemporary America, whether in the form of gerrymandered districts designed to dilute minority votes, excessive policing in black communities, the disproportionate targeting of black Americans by the criminal justice system, or the violent attempts to overturn electoral outcomes in events like the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Each of these occurrences is a reminder that history is not merely a set of dates and events to be memorized. It is a living, breathing influence that shapes our society, our policies, and our collective consciousness. Understanding this continuity requires more than a cursory glance at textbooks. It demands an honest confrontation with uncomfortable truths, a willingness to trace the patterns of exclusion, intimidation, and institutionalized inequality across centuries. The Reconstruction era, often celebrated superficially as a period of legislative progress and fleeting black political power, also serves as a cautionary tale. The failure of a society to uphold justice and equality allows oppression to evolve and adapt, finding new forms even after old structures fall. The lessons of Reconstruction are stark and instructive. They remind us that freedom without protection is fragile, that rights without enforcement can be easily stripped away, and that the promise of equality requires active and sustained commitment, not passive assumption. The same tools of control laws that appear neutral but target marginalized populations, the manipulation of political processes, and the selective application of justice continue to manifest in ways that echo the strategies employed by white supremacists in the 19th century. Recognizing this continuity is essential if we are to build a more just and equitable society, one in which the mistakes and betrayals of the past are neither repeated nor sanitized. Equally important, however, is acknowledging the resilience and resistance that have persisted across generations. Despite the systematic attempts to suppress black voices, communities have continued to organize, advocate, and fight for justice. From the civil rights movement of the 1960s to contemporary campaigns for voting rights, criminal justice reform, and economic equity, Black Americans have consistently challenged the structures designed to limit their potential. The narrative of Reconstruction and its aftermath is therefore not solely a story of victimhood. It is also a story of courage, determination, and the unyielding pursuit of dignity. Recognizing both the oppression and the resilience provides a more complete understanding of American history and underscores the responsibilities of all citizens to engage with it critically and constructively. The past, in this sense, becomes a guide and a call to action, reminding us that progress is neither inevitable nor guaranteed, but must be fought for, defended, and renewed across generations. As we bring this story to a close, it is worth reflecting on the broader implications for our society today. The injustices of Reconstruction, and the ways in which they were permitted to evolve, serve as a mirror, reflecting not only the failures of the past, but the challenges that persist in the present. Voter suppression efforts, economic disparities, and systemic inequities are not anomalies. They are part of a continuum that began during Reconstruction and has adapted to the contours of modern American life. By studying these historical patterns, we can better identify, confront, and dismantle them, ensuring that the promises of freedom, citizenship, and political participation are genuinely accessible to all. Each act of advocacy, each effort to reform institutions, and each engagement in the democratic process becomes part of a larger struggle to realize the ideals that Reconstruction promised but largely failed to deliver. History is both a warning and an inspiration, urging vigilance against the persistence of inequity while highlighting the transformative power of collective action and moral courage. In closing, thank you for taking the time to engage with this story and reflect on the lessons it offers. Your awareness, curiosity, and willingness to confront difficult truths are critical steps in shaping a society that values justice, equality, and inclusion. If you found this exploration illuminating and thought-provoking, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue uncovering these important stories together. Sharing this content helps ensure that these lessons reach a wider audience, fostering understanding, dialogue, and action. Remember, history is not just about the past, it shapes the present and informs the future. And each of us has a role to play in determining the trajectory of our shared society. By confronting the legacies of Reconstruction and committing to equity, we honor the struggles of those who came before us and contribute to a future where freedom and justice are not merely aspirational, but tangible realities for all. Thank you for watching, and let us continue learning, reflecting, and building a more just world together.